Hey, you guys, this is our first of four lectures on the Great Depression. Also, the New Deal is something that we'll get into, but thanks for joining me for the first one. Thanks for your patience, or maybe thanks for your anticipation waiting for the next lecture. Those of you that have said that they missed these over holiday break, I don't know if you're telling the truth or not, but thanks for humoring me. As we are getting into our next unit, the Great Depression. How do we go from the Roaring 20s, something that was so great you could get some booze and speakeasies illegally from a bootlegger on the street? You were able to meet new flappers and ride in breezies, these convertible cars, which are widely available at this time. How do we go from this time of tremendous joy and prosperity, seemingly at the height of the world in America at that time, down to the Great Depression, to being depressed, to having nothing to eat, maybe not having a job? How do we go to 25% unemployment, the highest in modern American history? Well, that's kind of what we're going to get into in this lecture. How does it start? How do we trigger what becomes the Great Depression? And as we go on to other lectures, we'll discuss really what America becomes during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So let's get into lecture today. Thanks for grabbing your notes and always being so astute and excited to be getting through lecture. I appreciate your enthusiasm. We will be assessed on this, so we'll get to that point too. This is important. Will be the last quiz you take of first semester. Will be this Great Depression and New Deal lecture. So we're kind of glossing over a lot of presidents. We talked about Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, and then there are several more in the 1900s. We kind of talked about Woodrow Wilson in World War I, and then after he leaves office, there's two Republicans that get elected. First Calvin Coolidge, then Herbert Hoover. And Hoover gets elected in 1928. They're both Republicans, so you would think kind of fiscally conservative, and maybe a lot of success of the 1920s, Roaring 20s, is due to them. Many historians place a lot of blame on Hoover, and it could go either direction, saying he didn't do enough in what became the stock market crash, which exploded into the Great Depression, or he could have done a lot more than he did. So kind of a very interesting place to be as a historian. It just depends on how you look at the stats and sort of analyze what happened during this time period in history. So Herbert Hoover, his famous phrase was, "Prosperity is right around the corner." And so he's trying to keep hope for American people as they go through the dredges of the Great Depression. This became sort of his mantra, or his election slogan, really, you could say, into the election in 1932 as well. But he was orphaned himself. He lost both of his parents, and he worked hard to sort of make a name. He kind of fell into politics by just trying to be the food administrator during World War I. So basically taking all the crops that American farmers raised, transporting that across the world and feeding the world. Very well regarded and very respected for his work that he did in the 1910s during World War I and after. And that's really what catapulted his political career to being a popular politician. He got elected president in 1928 when Calvin Coolidge decided not to run for a second term. A lot of historians debate why. Could he see that a Great Depression was coming because there's all this wealth being generated, prosperity, but on the back of credit? And with credit, it's debt, right? So as your debt is expanding, you have to pay it at some point, or you're going to experience this big bubble bursting, like a depression, or in our case, in 2008, a recession. And a lot of analysts are looking at what's happening in the future and saying, hey, the economy, stock market's doing really well, but people are without jobs because of COVID. So are we going to have a bubble that's going to burst? And what will that look like? A recession, depression? And so how bad things get determines whether we call it a recession or a depression. So, but really what triggered, this is like the spark to the powder keg that became the Great Depression, was what's called the Wall Street crash, or the crash. So in September 1929, for instance, the Dow Jones reached an all-time high of 381 points. And if you watch the stock market now, it's at 30,000. Okay, so, a lot of that's due to inflation, of course, and just how valuable business is and how prosperous we've been in the last 100 years. But that's just a comparison of where we're at, 380 compared to 30,000. So our economy right now is, in terms of the stock market and some of the investments you can make, and how many businesses are doing, especially tech businesses, are the best they've ever been. But a lot of, like I said, analysts aren't sure how long that's going to last, because you have all these restaurants that are going out of business, all these service industries going out of business because they can't serve and help people during this COVID time. So, but what we see in the 1920s is, by the time we got to October 29, 1929, it's called Black Thursday. There was a major sell-off of stocks. There was a panic of just this kind of bubble starting to burst. And actually the stock market, New York Stock Exchange, closed the next day on Friday, the 25th, and decided not to open because they're afraid if they open, it would be a mass sell-off of everyone coming in and selling their stocks. So they got some money back. And then they also did not open on Monday. On Monday, October 28th, they did not open. So when they did open on Black Tuesday, October 29th, this is the worst day in stock market history up until what we saw really in COVID times in March of this last year, 2020. Now it's last year. Wow, it's weird to say. But Black Tuesday, most people sold their stocks at an average loss of 40 points, which is huge. I should have given you better numbers, but they're losing 50, 70, 100% of the value of their stock that they had when they're investing just on that one day alone. So the overall loss just for that one day, to give you some perspective though, was $30 billion, which isn't a lot of money, saying that we're now $30 trillion in debt pretty much. But that is all that we spent fighting World War II for the 3 years we were fighting in World War I. So in one day, or really lumping the 2 days together, Black Thursday and Black Tuesday, is we lost on those 2 days all of that it took us to fight in World War I. So give you some perspective. So, and what did that trigger? Well, again, it was the spark that blew up this powder keg. We'll talk about the powder keg, what was packed in there that was going to cause this explosion that led to the Great Depression. We'll get to that coming up. But what is a depression? It is a period of severely reduced economic activity characterized by a sharp rise in unemployment. So really, there's not a lot of businesses, not a lot of opportunities to invest or to buy or to sell. That's reduced economic activity characterized by unemployment, meaning people are losing their jobs, businesses are closing, and that's how people are going out of work. During the Great Depression, it was 25%. Anything over 20% unemployment, economists call a depression. So in 2008, we only had a recession, not a depression, because we only experienced about 10% unemployment in 2008, 2009, 2010. So we called that a recession. If it got worse, like upwards of 20%, so it had to be twice as bad as what it was in 2008, then we would have had a depression. So it really judges, like, are people working? Are they employed or not? It kind of determines whether economists say we're in a recession or a depression. Okay, and we had like a short recession really during this COVID time. So in March, April, May, many people lost their jobs, and upwards of 10% of Americans were unemployed. And then as businesses started opening over the summer, the unemployment dropped drastically. Now it's still really high. It's at 5 and 6%, but it continues to go up. And so those are people that are without work and looking for jobs, able to work, that lost their jobs. We call them unemployed. So the crash triggered the depression, but did not cause it. Again, we'll talk about those causes. And what we call the Great Depression, so this time period in American history lasts from 1929 to 1941, basically until we enter into World War II. It took us a world war to really catapult us out of the Great Depression. Okay, and so here's the causes that we're getting into. Sort of what we saw in the 1920s is a very unstable economy where the nation's wealth is not evenly distributed, as in the richest Americans, like the richest 1%, maybe you've heard that term, are holding, 70% of the income. At this time, it was 50% of the income, and the rest of basically the 95% of Americans, owned 50% or less of the nation's wealth. Now Like in nowadays, we're talking the richest 1 and 5% own 90% of America's wealth. So now we still have this very unstable economy even now. That's why many economists are predicting there's going to be some volatility, as in the market or the economy is going to have a major slide coming up, because when so few own all of basically the business industry wealth, then there's nothing left for other people to survive on, and people lose their jobs, and it has catastrophic effects. And one of the reasons why is industries were making more goods than consumers wanted or could afford. It helped to launch this unstable economy. Another reason that is a cause for the Great Depression is over speculation. So a lot of people, it's not necessarily a lot, about 15% of Americans at this time were investing in the stock market. So it's not a big sort of margin of Americans that are investing in the stock market. Like right now, we have a lot more Americans that invest because we have 401ks through our workplaces, or we individually buy stocks, or we're like, yeah, Amazon's doing well, I want to buy that. And you get on Robinhood and they have all these apps, or E-Trade, and make some trades. So there's a lot more percentage of Americans participating in the stock market right now, and their income or retirement is hinging on how the stock market does. It wasn't the same in the 1920s, but those 15% that were investing, a lot of these investors were buying stocks on credit. And so all they had to do was put 10% of the value of the stock down. So if it was a $10 stock, let's say to buy, Ford Motor Company in 1920, they only had to put $1 down to buy that stock. Okay. But you're hoping that it's going to make basically 1,000% return, where instead of, $10 that you bought for, you're hoping it makes 20. Because if it makes that 20, if it doubles basically, then what's going to happen is you're going to recoup that credit that you made, that $9 that you bought on credit. It has to get to really $18 for you to make up that loss. You put down $1, you have $9 debt. So you need to make $9. So you need that stock price to get to $19 in order to even break even. So, but what's going to happen is once there's a little blip in the stock market, it's going to send fear and panic through those investors that are like, oh my gosh, I got to get my money out, or else I'm not going to have anything left and I'm going to be ruined. I'm going to go bankrupt because I'm not going to be able to cover all this debt, this credit that I extended to buy these stocks in. So basically the stock market boom of the 1920s was based on all this borrowed money being invested. And then when it was lost, then it's going to trigger this Great Depression. Okay. And I'm not necessarily an economist. I'm trying to do my best to explain these terms in a historical way. It's very interesting and intriguing, but I myself don't necessarily get all of it all the time or understand it. So, and then the government policies are also going to be a cause of the Great Depression. And during the 1920s, the government is going to cut interest rates to assist growth, meaning lots of people are going to go out and get loans and say, hey, I can't afford that, but I can get a loan. Hey, I don't have the money to plunk down on a car, but I'm going to get a loan on that. Oh, I'm going to go buy a house with a mortgage. So credit was a new invention of the 1920s, which extended to many different industries that Americans started to take advantage of. And why did the government start allowing credit? Well, we had to pay off the debts from World War I. So they're like, oh, let's, take this money that we have and start loaning it out. And people are buying things, which is going to generate economic return to help us pay off our World War I debts, which was a great idea. But when people are doing it and eventually can't pay their debts, it's going to bring about economic catastrophe. So also in 1929, the government's going to limit the money supply to discourage lending, because it used to be at those times money was tied to gold stored in Fort Knox or in United States Central Bank, and so we had to have this gold. So with each gold bar we had, we needed to have a certain dollar amounts in actual cash. So in order to make sure we didn't have to get more and more gold, they limited the amount of supply of money that could go out and be circulated. And what this did was discourage lending, which is going to have disastrous effects. And then number three, the U.S. government is also loaning a lot of the money we have to Europe to help them rebuild after World War I. So when we needed that money, when we needed that cash, it wasn't there because it was limited. We had loaned it over to Europe to help them rebuild. And so when we become in an economic bind, there's not any economic money left to try to stabilize our economy, and we just slide. Businesses fail, people lose their jobs, and people and businesses go bankrupt, and eventually the whole government system starts imploding. Okay. So what's Hoover's reaction? Now, he got elected in 1928, so he's there. He gets inaugurated in March 1929. And so as October 1929 happens, he still has another 3 years or 2 good years, 2.5 years to serve on his presidency. Well, and this is where historians differ. Some say Hoover did very little to react. He actually, some people would say he didn't do enough. Others would say he did too much. So what he did is he took a lot of that debt that we had and he kept spending money and out to government programs that were assisting businesses and assisting farmers. So he had a very liberal sort of money policy, hoping that the more money in circulation, the more money that the federal government was spending, but also likewise going into debt, that we'd be able to spend our way out. And that's kind of always been our mantra. For this time, it didn't work because there wasn't enough money, even that debt that continued to compound in our national economy didn't help us get out. So because we kept going into more and more debt, it prolonged how long that depression was. So again, it's interesting to read, but overall, he kept saying, hey, prosperity's right around the corner. I'm the president. This isn't so bad. We're going to get out of this. And he believed that people should pick themselves up. Hey, we made this mess. We can get out of it. Okay. If you're out of a job, keep going to look for another one. Start a business, go do this or that. So it kind of really wasn't the message that Americans wanted to hear. It could be a powerful one, but maybe not during the Great Depression when so many people are suffering at once. It'd be tough to find that hope and encouragement. And so what happens in America really has worldwide effects, because once our depression happens, the same phenomena happens all over the world, where people in economies around the world in Europe start to become crippled and collapse as well. I won't say full-scale collapse, but they go into a Great Depression. The worst was in Germany. They were already in a depression throughout the 1920s because of the Treaty of Versailles, which was made specifically to cripple Germany. And they had $38 billion to pay back. So they were already crippled by having to make those payments. And they had poor leadership there, which is, again, going to be one of the reasons why Hitler comes to the scene and takes power, and many are fine with it. We'll get there when we get to World War II. But America's stock market crash really catapults the world into a Great Depression. Okay. And so what is the worldwide reaction? And through the 1930s, for us, we stay a democracy, but there's talk of, hey, we need to become a communist country. We're going to have communist agitators, even here in Seattle, here in Everett. It's going to be a major sort of hub for a lot of people that have communist or socialistic mentalities, and they want to see sort of the United States democracy overthrown and change for a communist government. And we're going to go all the other way too, where we're going to have American fascists that want stronger leadership from the government. And so, and there's going to be all those in between. It's kind of a marvel to our American system that we stayed a democratic republic, as we have always been under the Constitution, because there's a lot of turmoil, especially politically, during the 1930s and the Great Depression. Kind of like today, a lot of turmoil happening in the streets, a lot of protests, a lot of people not happy with the way our system of government is run or being run, both from conservatives or from liberals. And so, there's a lot of reasons why that's happening, and historians are talking about it, news is talking about it if you're tuning in. So, but where do some other countries turn? Well, some countries turn to what's called fascism, where they want to get out of this depression by having a system of government with an absolute dictator or one party that's characterized by racism and militarism. And Italy and Germany are the best examples of that. Or they want to turn to communism, which is a system of collective ownership with a single political party or dictator in power, where basically the state owns all the property, they own all the business, they own everything, and they tell the citizens what to do. We call this a totalitarian system of government, where they have total control over your life. Okay, and so both systems historically in the world have not worked. These systems collapse. Um, and so that's kind of the beauty of America, staying in between and doing the best we can with the democratic republic that we have. And Russia is the greatest example of a communistic country, but they're going to expand. Not necessarily in the 1930s. There's going to be other countries that try it, but especially we'll see in the 1950s and 60s, many countries in that time of the Cold War turn to communism. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Cold War. Okay, and so well, maybe I'll stop here. That's the worldwide reaction. Yeah, thanks for hanging with me. This is 20 minutes. This is a good intro. Yeah, a good intro into the Great Depression. So I'll stop here, and we're ending sort of on how the Great Depression affected the world, and some others countries looked at different systems of government, different economic setups. And so we stayed right kind of in the center with our democratic republic. We have a capitalistic system to our economy, and we stay there and have stayed there to this day. So, but we'll continue with this next lecture, and we'll get into sort of the demise of Herbert Hoover. He doesn't get reelected to a second term, and then how we sort of inaugurate in a new president, our only president elected 4 times in American history, and that's Franklin Roosevelt. And how could that happen? Well, we'll get there in our next lecture. All right, thank you.